everyone, it's Liz from Back to the Bookshelf. It is freezing cold here in Virginia, so I've been cuddled up with my hot tea and a good book, cuddled up in bed, reading. So I thought this was a great opportunity to share with you some of my favorite books and to learn a little bit more about your favorite books. So we will start with this one that I have right here. It's a hefty one. This is Outlander by Diana Gabaldon, and this is one of my more recent favorites. A student staff member had recommended this on a list of books maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, and I went to Barnes & Noble and bought a pile of books and shoved them on my bookshelf and then never looked at them again. Until about 3 years ago when the Starz Network decided to bring these books to a TV adaptation. And then I was like, that sounds familiar, so I'm going to go read it. I read it, and I'm obsessed, and I have never turned back. So Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. It really is a genre buster of a book. A lot of people see it classified as a historical romance or romance, but it is so much more than that. Yes, there is a lot of romance in this book, but there's also a lot of historical research and detail. There's fantasy. There is action. It really is every genre. There's humor in it. It follows the story of Claire Randall, who is a 1940s a British World War II nurse who falls through some standing stones and ends up back in the 1740s Jacobite Scotland, where she encounters a clan of Scotsmen. And she eventually ends up marrying one of the Scotsmen back in the day, but then goes back in time, back to the 1940s. So this story really goes from like 1940s Britain to 1740s Scotland to like 1960s Boston, what have you. So all over the place. And it even makes a foray into Revolutionary era America. So love that. And the one thing that I really, really appreciate is the historic attention to detail that the author provides. You can tell that she definitely researches what was going on at the time, what life was like, what people were eating, what they were wearing, what the plans were like. It's just an inexhaustive historical detail. So I love it. This is the first book of what will be 10 books, and I believe the author is working on book 9 as we speak. Let's see what else. This is another recent favorite. This is Call the Midwife by Jennifer Worth, and this is a memoir about about her time as a midwife in the Poplar section of London in the 1940s, 1950s, early 60s. And she was a nurse that made house calls, but she also worked in a convent / midwifery, I don't even know what you would call it, midwife house, that helped with female health care, including home births, but they also did general medicine where they went around to various houses and provided medical care that way. First of all, it talks about a time period and a career that I never really knew much about. I didn't know much about midwifery, didn't know about home births, didn't know a lot about the British healthcare system at that time and then how it morphed into what it is today. So she intersperses her own experiences with historical information about all those topics, about healthcare and midwifery. And it just absolutely fascinating because the area of the town that she was working in was not the wealthiest. And so you got to see a slice of life of the poorer people and how they lived their life and what kind of health care that they received. But the thing that I think I like the most about this is not only does it provide a snapshot of a time period that I didn't really know much about, and a very thorough snapshot at that, but it also is a very colorful description of a way of life that was going to disappear very shortly. Shortly after she finished her time that she documented here, a lot of the tenements that she worked in were bulldozed. A lot of women started having births in the hospital rather than home, and then the onset of the contraception pill also drastically changed the way that women were having children. So extremely fascinating read, and I recommend it to everyone. And also I recommend the TV show that this book series is based on. It is a BBC production, but here in the US it is on PBS. And I believe there's some seasons on Netflix as well. So Call the Midwife. Let's see, this is The Unthinkable, Who Survives When Disaster Strikes and Why, by Amanda Ripley. So this is a nonfiction book, and I found it extremely intriguing because I love stories about why people do what they do. So Amanda Ripley is a writer for Time magazine, or she was whenever this book was written. I think she may have departed that post since then. But she does write about a lot of interesting topics, and I've come across some of them in my reading. And she tends to write a lot about education. So if you're interested in education or interesting things that you've never known about, read anything by Amanda Ripley. So in this book, she is exploring exactly how do humans respond to disaster. And she interviews people that were in hostage situations, hurricanes, tsunamis, 9/11, plane crashes, any kind of disaster imaginable. She's interviewed people, as well as interviewing psychologists and scientists and anyone who has any say in the human response during a disaster, to try to figure out why do people act like they do in a disaster, and how can we increase the odds of survival in a disaster. So it's part historical anecdote, part how to survive a disaster manual, which I found absolutely fascinating. And one of the standout pieces of information from this book is when a disaster happens to you, the people around you will dictate whether you live or die. So just something to keep in mind. But The Unthinkable, it's fantastic. Okay, another childhood favorite is Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery. So this classic book is about, I think she was 11, an 11-year-old redheaded, sharp-tongued girl. Takes place in Canada, probably at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. And she is a sharp-tongued orphan girl that mistakenly gets sent to an elderly brother and sister pair who were initially seeking a boy to help out at the farm. And despite some setbacks and some antics, they decide to keep Anne and adopt her. And so this book, which is the first of a series of about 8 books, is an introduction to the delightful Anne, and it's full of her adventures and antics and all the trouble that she gets into, but yet all the beauty she sees in life and that she brings to others around her. And I just remember being intrigued by this character who, even though this was written back in like the 1870s, seems ahead of her time. She really does seem like a modern heroine, but I found her to be very funny and sweet and endearing and very genuine. So if you want a strong female lead type book, Anne of Green Gables is the way to go. All right, another childhood book. It's the big one. The 11th Hour by Graham Bass, who is an Australian author illustrator. And I was introduced to this in elementary school in class, where we formed groups and we had to solve the puzzle. So it's another whodunit. It's about Horace the elephant and all of his animal friends who get invited to a party, and then someone steals the birthday cake. And so the readers need to figure out by looking at clues throughout all the pictures, like that's a clue, all the border's a clue, maybe that fork's a clue, but everything's a clue. And you have to read the story, but then also look at all the little details on each page to try to solve. That's a clue. Look, there's words across their bags. So we'd have to try to figure out who done it. And then at the end, there was a cipher. Like you can see my notes from school, I was still trying to figure out. And I think this book also helped me learn how to use the library, because look, I obviously printed out some hieroglyphics at the library. And they do have an extensive answer key here, and this takes you page by page. I've peeked. I've not yet ripped the seal. Page by page of every clue that's on every page, and it is quite extensive to figure out who done it. So if you're looking for something to enrich your students' lives or your own life, or if you want something to do on a long snowy weekend, or something interactive to work with your child or your friend, The 11th Hour by Graham Base. And I do have some favorites that I don't have actual books for, but I will share them with you anyway. So you can tell I like series and trilogies and things like that. My next favorite is the Mark of the Lion trilogy series by Francine Rivers, and they are 3 large books. So, and I recommend you just buy them all or get them all at the same time, because you're going to plow right through them and want to go to the next one. So it takes place in biblical era Rome, and it follows the stories of a slave girl, a gladiator, and a Roman aristocrat. And it's one of those series where you start with their individual stories, but by the end they're all intertwining. And once again, it provides a great historical detail and information. It does take place in biblical times, and faith is a big part of some of the characters in the stories, but also lack of faith is also a big part for some of the characters. But it's hardly like a Bible-thumping story, and you don't need to be a Christian to understand what's going on in the book. But one thing that I loved about this book, besides all the historical detail, was the character development. Like, all these characters, they seem like real life people that you could encounter on the street. And I remember reading some of these characters, parts of the stories with certain characters, and having like a visceral reaction of how much I hated a certain character. And that's just a testament to how great the author is in developing their characters and integrating them into a story. So just a fantastic series of books, and I highly recommend them. And they came highly recommended to me by one of my students as well. Another favorite book is Bossy Pants by Tina Fey, and so that is a memoir by the Saturday Night Live 30 Rock comedian. And it tells about her life as a child, tells about life growing up, college anecdotes. It shares information as she tried to break into comedy when she was at Second City in Chicago, and also talks about her later career in movies and 30 Rock and Saturday Night Live. I highly recommend the audiobook over the actual book, which is something that I don't do all that often, but the Bossy Pants audiobook is narrated by Tina Fey, and so she adds her own inflections and other little stories and snippets that aren't in the hardcover book or in the paper book. So, and it's laugh out loud hilarious. So I highly recommend Bossy Pants to everyone when they're like, I need a good book to read. I'm like, Bossy Pants, you will love it. Let's see. Another book is once again part of a series. It's called Life as We Knew It by Susan Beth Pfeffer. It's a young adult novel, and it's part of I think a quartet of 4 books that look at this happening from different angles and different characters. But in this book, it's modern day, and a comet hits the moon, forcing the moon closer to Earth, and it causes tsunamis and earthquakes and other kinds of disasters with a large loss of life. And it follows a high school student and her family's story of survival in the year following that disaster. And it is just, once again, it's harkening back to The Unthinkable by Amanda Ripley, like why people do what they do in disasters, and then how does life go on, essentially. So it was a really quick read because it is a smaller book, and it deals with a fascinating topic. So those are my favorite books for right now. And I would love to hear what some of your favorite books are. So please write them down in the comments if you want to share your experiences or suggest some more books.